It all began on a Wednesday. You know, the kind of day that's so ordinary you wouldn't think your life could change in a single moment. I came home earlier than usual from work because I'd had this nagging feeling in my gut all day. Susie, my wife of 7 years, had been acting off for a while. It wasn't anything obvious, just little things. New perfume she didn't wear around me, phone calls she took in the garage, and those girls' nights that always seemed to stretch a little later than they should. I pulled into the driveway and saw that her car wasn't there. No big deal. She often ran errands before picking up our boys from school. But as I walked into the house, something didn't sit right. The scent of her perfume was in the air, fresh, like she'd just been there. I was halfway up the stairs when her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. Susie never left her phone behind. Ever. Curious, I swiped to glance at the notification. It was a text from a number saved as Jackie. It read, "Let's meet same spot. For 30. Can't wait." My blood ran cold. Jackie wasn't her coworker. Jackie didn't exist. I sat down hard in one of the kitchen chairs, staring at that screen as my world tilted. The pieces started to come together, and suddenly I wasn't the loving, clueless husband anymore. I decided to follow her. I grabbed my keys and left, adrenaline pumping so hard I could barely think straight. I didn't know what I'd find, but I was going to find something. At exactly 4:25, I parked a block away from the address Susie had texted Jackie about. I waited, my heart pounding, eyes glued to the door of a rundown diner. And then I saw her. My wife, radiant as ever, stepped out of a yellow cab. But she wasn't alone. A middle-aged man with a grizzled beard got out after her, his hand brushing her lower back as they walked inside. A taxi driver? My chest constricted as I watched them laughing, their heads tilted close. He wasn't just some random driver giving her a lift. He was something else. I stayed in the car, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Whatever they were up to, I was going to find out. I didn't have the luxury of patience. Sitting in the car, imagining what they were doing, wasn't an option. So, I stepped out, my heart hammering in my chest, and made my way to the diner. The little bell over the door jingled as I entered, but they didn't notice. They were too engrossed in each other, tucked away in a booth near the back. Susie was leaning forward, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her coffee cup. She looked alive, more animated than I'd seen her in months. The taxi driver, gruff with a wiry frame, sat across from her, smirking as if he'd won some prize. His hand rested on the table, dangerously close to hers. I slid into a booth where I could see them but wasn't easily seen. My mind raced as I watched them. They weren't lovers yet, or at least not here. The tension between them was palpable, though like a thread stretched so tight it could snap at any moment. I strained to hear their conversation over the clatter of dishes and the murmur of other diners. "I can't keep doing this," she said, her voice low but firm. My chest lightened for a second. Maybe she was ending it, but her next words hit me like a freight train. "It's too risky meeting at the diner every time. We need somewhere private." He chuckled, leaning back in his seat, his hand finally brushing hers. "You're the one with a family to lose, sweetheart. I just drive the cab." Susie flushed but didn't pull her hand away. "That's not fair, Johnny," she snapped a little louder. "You don't understand what I've given up to." She stopped short, her eyes darting around the room. For a second, I thought she'd seen me, but her gaze moved on, and she settled back into the conversation. My head swirled. Johnny. So now he had a name. And not just a name, a place in my wife's life I hadn't realized someone could take. I forced myself to breathe, to keep still as they wrapped up their coffee. They stood to leave, and I ducked low in my booth. As they passed, I caught a snippet of their parting words. "Same time next week," she murmured, her voice almost soft. "You got it," he replied, his tone smug. The bell jingled again as they exited. My stomach churned as I watched them climb into his cab and drive off together. This wasn't just a fling. It wasn't just about lust. It was a betrayal deeply rooted, like a weed twisting through every part of my life. And now that I'd seen it, I wasn't about to let it grow. Not without a fight. The sight of them driving off together burned itself into my brain. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel and followed the yellow cab from a safe distance. My heart pounded, my chest tight with a cocktail of rage and dread. Where were they going? To a hotel? To his place? The possibilities churned in my mind like a storm. Johnny's cab weaved through downtown traffic before turning onto a quieter residential street. The houses here were old but well kept, the kind with wraparound porches and perfectly trimmed hedges. He pulled into the driveway of a modest bungalow, and she followed him inside without hesitation. I parked a block away and killed the engine, staring at the house like it was the scene of a crime. My breath fogged the windshield as I fought the urge to march up to the door and kick it in. But what then? Accuse her on the spot? Get into a fistfight with a cab driver? No, I needed to be smart about this. I waited, every minute stretching into eternity. My mind painted vivid, sickening images of what might be happening inside. I clenched the steering wheel, the vinyl groaning under my grip. Then, an idea struck me. If I couldn't confront them yet, I could still gather proof. I reached into the glove box and pulled out my phone, switching to the camera. Stepping out of the car, I stayed low and moved closer to the house, keeping to the shadows. I didn't care about being subtle anymore. I needed evidence, something irrefutable. The blinds in the living room were partially open, and I crouched in the bushes just outside. Inside, I saw Susie pacing the room, her arms crossed. Johnny was relaxed, leaning against the arm of a couch, his body language infuriatingly casual. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but the way he reached out to touch her wrist was enough to send my blood boiling. I snapped pictures, 1, 2, 3, of her standing too close, of him laughing while she looked away, biting her lip. This wasn't just coffee. It wasn't just flirting. It was something deeper, darker. I retreated to my car, my hands shaking as I reviewed the photos. They weren't as damning as I'd hoped, but they were enough to show me that my instincts hadn't been wrong. I sat there, staring at the house, wondering what kind of man I'd become to be skulking around like this. But I shoved the guilt aside. Susie had driven me here. An hour passed before the front door opened. Susie emerged first, smoothing her hair, her face unreadable. Johnny followed, his hand brushing her back again as they walked to his cab. I snapped another picture. They drove off and I didn't follow this time. I had seen enough. I knew enough. But now came the hard part, deciding what to do next. Confront her? Set a trap? Or bide my time and let this play out until I had everything I needed to bring her world crashing down. The options swirled in my head as I sat in the dark, plotting my next move. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Susie's face, the way she laughed with him, the way she let him touch her. I replayed it all, dissecting every detail, trying to make sense of what had happened to the woman I thought I knew. By morning, my resolve had hardened. If I was going to confront her, I needed to do it right. Not in anger, not impulsively. I needed to corner her with the truth, force her to admit it without any room for denial. Until then, I'd act as if nothing had changed. It wasn't easy, though. Susie came home late that night. She breezed in like she hadn't spent the evening with another man, kissed me on the cheek, and asked how my day had been. Her nonchalance was like a dagger twisting in my gut. I mumbled something about work and kept my eyes on the TV, afraid she'd see the fire burning behind them. The next morning, she was up early, humming softly as she packed the boys' lunches. I watched her from the kitchen table, sipping my coffee, my stomach churning at how easily she wore the mask of the perfect wife and mother. Big plans today? I asked casually, testing the waters. Just the usual, she replied, glancing at me with that familiar, innocent smile. Work, errands, picking up the kids. What about you? I shrugged. The same. Her lies were effortless, and for a moment, I felt a pang of nostalgia for the days when I believed them. But I shoved it aside. Nostalgia wouldn't save me now. Later that day, I decided to dig deeper. If Susie was hiding this affair, there had to be more evidence. I waited until she was in the shower, then slipped into our bedroom and grabbed her phone from the nightstand. My hands trembled as I scrolled through her messages, but there was nothing. No texts from Jackie, no calls to Johnny. Then I remembered the cab. Johnny's car had to have GPS, right? Maybe there was a trail I could follow. After work, I drove to the address where I'd seen them together. I parked nearby and waited, hoping Johnny would show up. My patience paid off. Around 7 p.m., his cab pulled into the driveway, and I watched as he disappeared inside the house. I didn't wait long before approaching the car. Peering inside, I noticed a small GPS device mounted on the dash. If I could just access it. The front door opened, and I ducked out of sight. My pulse pounded in my ears as Johnny sauntered to the car, whistling. He climbed in and drove off, completely unaware I'd been seconds from breaking into his cab. I followed him again, keeping my distance, until he parked outside a bar. This time, I got out of my car and went inside. Johnny was at the counter, nursing a drink, chatting up the bartender like he owned the place. He didn't even notice when I took a seat at the other end of the bar, watching him, studying him. This wasn't just about Susie anymore. Johnny was the key to unraveling this entire web of deceit. And as I sat there, plotting my next move, I realized I wasn't just hunting for the truth. I was preparing for war. Johnny sat at the bar, the picture of smug confidence. He laughed easily, gesturing with his hands as he spun some story for the bartender. I sipped my beer, pretending to watch the muted football game on the TV above the bar, but my focus never left him. He was too comfortable, too at ease for a man tangled up with a married woman. Did he even care about the damage he was causing? Or was I just another sucker in a long line of betrayed husbands? The thought made my blood boil. I needed a way in, a way to get close without tipping him off. So, when he got up to play pool with a couple of guys, I seized the moment. The bartender, a wiry guy in his mid-30s, was stacking clean glasses behind the counter. "Hey," I said, sliding a 20 across the bar. "What's his story?" I nodded toward Johnny. The bartender raised an eyebrow, pocketing the cash. "Johnny? Drives a cab. Always in here after his shifts. Friendly guy, good tipper. Does he come here alone?" "Most of the time." The bartender hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "Why? He cause you trouble or something?" I forced a laugh. "Nah, just curious. He looks familiar, but I can't place him." The bartender shrugged and moved off to serve another customer. Johnny was racking the balls now, his back to me, but my mind was racing. He didn't seem like the type to hide. If anything, he flaunted his presence, his confidence bordering on arrogance. When his pool game ended, he returned to the bar and I saw my chance. Grabbing my half-empty beer, I slid onto the stool next to him. "Hey man, nice shot out there," I said, nodding toward the pool table. Johnny glanced at me, then offered a tight smile. "Thanks." "Johnny, right?" I extended my hand. "Name's Alex. Pretty sure I've seen you driving around. You do airport runs, right?" "Yeah," he said, shaking my hand briefly before turning back to his drink. "All over the city. Busy gig?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. He smirked. "Always." I nursed my beer, throwing out small talk, playing the part of the friendly stranger. Johnny was cagey at first, but a few compliments on his pool skills and a round of whiskey loosened him up. "You married, Alex?" he asked, his words slurring slightly. "Yeah, going on 7 years," I said, forcing a grin. "What about you?" Johnny snorted. "Hell no. No ball and chain for me. Women are fun, but I like to keep it simple, you know?" The bitterness in his voice wasn't lost on me. I decided to push a little further. "Must be nice, man."
No commitments, no strings punto.
"You're damn right," he said, raising his glass. "Especially when you find someone who's available." My jaw tightened, but I kept my face neutral. "Yeah? Got someone special like that?" Johnny's grin widened. "Maybe. A guy's gotta have his secrets, right?" It took everything I had not to lunge at him. Instead, I finished my beer, nodded, and clapped him on the shoulder. "Smart man," I said. "Keep it simple." I walked out of the bar, my head buzzing. Not from the alcohol, but from the realization that Johnny was far too comfortable in his role. He wasn't just some fling for Susie. He was a predator, and he didn't care who he hurt. As I drove home, I knew one thing for certain. If Johnny thought he could waltz into my life and steal my wife without consequences, he was in for a rude awakening. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next day, I couldn't shake Johnny's smug grin from my mind. Every word he'd said in that bar replayed like a broken record. He was proud of what he was doing, like taking another man's wife was some kind of accomplishment. That's when I decided I wasn't going to wait for Susie to come clean. I was going to force her hand. But first I needed more. More proof, more leverage. Something so undeniable she couldn't lie her way out of it. That meant following Johnny again. I spent the afternoon parked near his usual haunts, tracking his cab as he picked up fares and dropped them off. He didn't lead me to Susie that day, but he didn't need to. His route led me to his routine, and routines could be exploited. By evening, I was ready. Susie came home just as I was setting the table for dinner, her smile as sweet as ever. She kissed my cheek, but this time I didn't flinch. Instead, I played the role of the clueless husband, laughing with the kids and complimenting her on the lasagna she'd made last week. "You're in a good mood," she said, raising an eyebrow as we cleaned up the dishes. "Just appreciating the little things," I replied, smiling. It was true in a way. I appreciated how little time she had left to keep lying to me. After the boys went to bed, I made my move. "Hey, Susie," I said casually. "I was thinking we should plan a weekend away. Just us. Get a babysitter for the boys. Maybe go to the mountains." She froze for a split second, so brief most people wouldn't have noticed. But I wasn't most people. "That sounds great," she said, her voice just a little too bright. "Let me check my calendar at work. Things have been so busy lately." I nodded, biting back a bitter laugh. Busy, right? Busy betraying me with a man who probably hadn't changed his sheets in weeks. When she went to bed, I stayed up late, combing through the photos I'd taken and rereading every message I'd managed to recover from her phone. It was all leading to something, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Then, around midnight, I got my answer. An alert popped up on the GPS tracking app I'd secretly installed on Susie's car weeks ago. She was on the move. My heart raced as I grabbed my keys and followed the blinking on my phone screen. It led me to a motel on the edge of town, the kind with flickering neon signs and curtains that never quite close all the way. Her car was parked outside room 206. I killed the engine and waited, my pulse hammering in my ears. 10 minutes later, Johnny's yellow cab pulled into the lot. He stepped out, looked around casually, then walked straight to room 206. I had them. There was no more doubt, no more guesswork. My wife and her lover were holed up in a dingy motel, and the question wasn't whether I'd confront them. It was how. I didn't barge in. Not yet. Instead, I took pictures of the car, the cab, the room number. I wanted to burn the image into my memory, let the betrayal sink in until there was no trace of hesitation left. When the time came to strike, I wanted it to be decisive, devastating. As I drove home, the beginnings of a plan formed in my mind. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and making them both regret ever thinking they could play me for a fool. The first strike was coming, and it would leave a mark they'd never forget. The next morning, I felt an eerie calm settle over me. I had spent the night piecing together a plan. One that would leave no room for excuses, no escape for Susie or Johnny. They had backed me into a corner, and now I was going to show them just how dangerous a cornered man could be. First, I needed to bait them. I wanted to catch them red-handed, something that would shatter their cozy little bubble of secrecy. The photos I had taken were good, but I needed something undeniable, something that would expose the full scope of their betrayal. I started with Susie. Over breakfast, I casually mentioned that I had to leave town for a work conference on Friday and wouldn't be back until late Sunday. Her reaction was subtle, but it was there. The faintest flicker of relief in her eyes, quickly masked by a smile. "That's too bad," she said, sipping her coffee. "The boys and I will miss you. Just a couple of days," I replied, hiding my smirk. "You'll manage." After she left for work, I set the second part of my plan in motion. I called in sick, then drove to the motel from the night before. Room 206. I slipped a $100 bill to the desk clerk and got everything I needed. The name on the room reservation, the dates it had been booked, and confirmation that it had been rented under Johnny's name for the upcoming weekend. Perfect. That evening, I planted the seeds with Johnny. I returned to the bar where he liked to hang out, arriving just as he was settling in for his first drink. This time, I didn't bother with small talk. I slid onto the stool next to him and grinned. "Johnny," I said, my tone friendly but firm, "we should grab a beer sometime. You seem like a guy who knows how to have fun." He glanced at me, suspicious at first, but the promise of camaraderie and free drinks softened him. "Sure," he said, raising his glass. "Why not?" We chatted for a while, just enough to make him think I was harmless. As he left, I slapped him on the back and said, "Don't let the ladies run you ragged, man." He laughed, a little too loudly, and left without another thought. By Friday, everything was in place. I packed an overnight bag to keep up appearances and kissed Susie goodbye as I left for my work trip. Instead, I parked my car a few blocks away and waited, watching from a distance as she went about her day. She seemed calm, confident, even humming to herself as she dropped the kids off at my parents' house for the weekend. Around 8 p.m., her car pulled into the motel parking lot. I followed, parking in the shadows, and watched as Johnny's cab arrived a few minutes later. They disappeared into room 206 together, just as I had predicted. But this time I wasn't leaving. I grabbed my bag, packed not with clothes, but with tools of exposure. A voice recorder, a camera, and a small device that would broadcast everything inside that room directly to my phone. It wasn't just revenge anymore. It was justice. And by the time I was done, they wouldn't just be sorry. They'd be exposed for the liars they were. I approached the door to room 206 with the precision of a soldier, every step deliberate, my heart steady. This wasn't the end yet. It was only the beginning. The motel hallway smelled of mildew and regret, but I barely noticed as I approached room 206. My heartbeat was steady now, the adrenaline sharpening my focus. I slipped the tiny recording device beneath the door, its microphone angled perfectly to pick up everything happening inside. Next, I attached a small wireless camera to the edge of the window, its lens peeking through the gap in the curtain. With my phone connected to both devices, I walked back to my car, parked in a shadowy corner of the lot. I settled in, watching the live feed on my screen, each second dragging like an eternity. Inside, Susie and Johnny sat on the edge of the bed, laughing over a half-empty bottle of wine. Her shoes were off, her legs tucked beneath her, while he leaned closer, his hand resting on her thigh. I clenched my fists, but I didn't look away. This was what I needed. Proof not just for me, but for anyone who might try to dismiss this as some misunderstanding. "I've missed this," Susie said, her voice tinged with something that made my stomach churn. Johnny smirked. "You've got it good, sweetheart. Most people don't get this kind of escape." "Yeah, well," she replied, trailing off as she sipped her wine. "It's not exactly easy. Alex is always watching. But this weekend..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. My grip on the phone tightened as Johnny leaned in to kiss her. The feed captured everything. The laughter, the whispers, the way she melted into him as if the past 7 years of our life together had been erased. But I forced myself to stay calm. Bursting in now would ruin everything. An hour passed. I documented every moment, snapping screenshots and recording clips. When Johnny finally stepped into the bathroom, Susie reached for her phone. I seized the opportunity, dialing her number from an anonymous app. The call startled her, and she stared at the screen for a moment before answering. "Hello?" she said cautiously. "Enjoying your little getaway, Susie?" I asked, my voice cold and unrecognizable. She froze, her expression shifting to panic. "Who is this?" You think you're clever, don't you? I continued, my tone measured. Sneaking around, lying to your husband. But the thing about lies, Susie, is they always unravel. Her breathing quickened. I don't know who you are. But you will, I interrupted. Enjoy tonight, because when the sun comes up, your world will fall apart. I hung up before she could respond, watching through the camera as she stared at the phone, her face pale and stricken. Johnny emerged from the bathroom, oblivious to her distress, and poured himself another glass of wine. For a moment, I felt a flicker of guilt, but it was snuffed out by the weight of her betrayal. This wasn't a game anymore. It was war. As I drove away, I knew the final act was approaching. Tomorrow I'd confront her. Not just as her husband, but as the man who held every card in his hand. And when I laid them all out, Susie and Johnny would have nowhere to run. The next morning dawned cold and gray, fitting for what was about to unfold. I sat in my car, parked just outside our driveway, staring at the home that had once felt like my sanctuary. The boys were still at my parents' house, thankfully shielded from what was coming. I hadn't slept, but I didn't need rest. I needed closure. Every piece of evidence I'd gathered sat in a neat folder on the passenger seat. Photos, videos, timestamps, even a log of every text and call Susie had made to Johnny over the past month. At 9 a.m., Susie's car pulled into the driveway. She stepped out, wearing the same clothes as the night before, her face tight with nerves. Good. She'd gotten my message loud and clear. I followed her inside, silent as a shadow. She didn't notice me at first, too busy setting her keys and purse on the counter. When she turned and saw me standing there, her gasp was almost satisfying. "Alex," she said, forcing a smile. "You're back early." I didn't reply, just stared at her. Her forced cheeriness faded under the weight of my silence. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice faltering. I held up the folder and tossed it onto the kitchen table. "You tell me." Her eyes darted to the folder, then back to me, panic flashing across her face. "What is that? Open it." She hesitated, then reached for the folder with trembling hands. As she flipped through the contents, her breathing quickened. Photos of her and Johnny at the diner. Screenshots of their messages. Images of her at the motel. I can explain," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't," I said sharply, my voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Don't insult me with excuses. I saw you. I followed you. I listened to your lies." Tears welled in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she whispered. "Then how was it supposed to happen, Susie?" I demanded. "Were you planning to sneak around forever? Keep me in the dark while you played house with a cab driver?" "It's not what you think," she insisted, her voice breaking. "Stop," I barked, slamming my hand on the table. "It is exactly what I think. You lied to me, to our boys. You threw away our life for, what? Cheap thrills with a guy who probably doesn't even know your middle name." Her tears spilled over, but I didn't care. She tried to reach for me, but I stepped back, the disgust clear on my face. "Alex, please," she pleaded. "I made a mistake, a horrible mistake. But I still love you. I still want." "No," I interrupted, my voice cold. "You don't get to say that. Love doesn't look like this." The silence that followed was deafening. Susie sank into a chair, her head in her hands, sobbing. But I wasn't moved. I had already given her too much of myself. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "I'll be filing for divorce. The boys will stay with me. You can figure out your next steps with Johnny." Her head shot up, her face pale.
Alex, no.
"Please, we can fix this." "You already fixed it," I snapped. "You fixed it the moment you chose him over me. Over us." I turned and walked out, her cries echoing behind me. As I climbed into my car and drove away, I felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was the first step toward reclaiming the life she tried to steal from me. This wasn't the end of my story. but it was the end of hers in my life. The days that followed were a blur of lawyers, paperwork, and cold, suffocating reality. Susie tried calling me, texting me, even leaving tearful voicemails. I didn't answer any of them. I wasn't interested in her explanations or apologies anymore. She'd made her choices, and now she could live with them. I moved quickly, securing a temporary custody arrangement for the boys. My lawyer assured me that with the evidence I'd gathered, I had a strong case for full custody. Susie had crossed a line, and the courts would see it too. But what haunted me most was telling our boys. They were too young to understand the complexities of betrayal, but they would feel the cracks in the foundation of their world. I sat them down one evening after dinner, their innocent faces looking up at me with wide eyes. "Boys," I began, my voice trembling slightly, "Mom and Dad are going to spend some time apart. It doesn't mean we don't love you, okay? This is just something we have to do." "Why?" my youngest asked, his voice small and confused. How could I explain without shattering their innocence? "Sometimes adults make mistakes," I said carefully. "And when that happens, they need to figure things out." They nodded slowly, not fully understanding but trusting me enough to accept it. It broke my heart. I hugged them both tightly, promising that no matter what, I would always be there for them. Susie, on the other hand, wasn't handling things as well. She showed up at the house a week after I filed, banging on the door like a woman possessed. I opened it just enough to block her entry. "Alex, please," she begged, her face streaked with tears. "We need to talk. I can't lose my family. I can't lose you." I kept my voice steady. "You already did, Susie." She tried to push past me, her desperation palpable. "It didn't mean anything. Johnny was just a distraction. I was lost, but I want to come back. Please, Alex." "You weren't lost," I replied coldly. "You knew exactly what you were doing every time you walked into that motel. Every time you lied to my face." Her shoulders sagged, and for a moment I thought she might collapse. But then her expression hardened, her tears drying into bitterness. "You think you're so perfect," she spat. "Maybe if you'd paid more attention to me, I wouldn't have needed someone else." I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Blame me all you want, Susie. It doesn't change the fact that you destroyed this marriage." I closed the door in her face and locked it, her angry shouts muffled on the other side. I leaned against the door, exhaling shakily. Her venom didn't hurt me anymore. It only confirmed that I was making the right decision. The fallout extended beyond our home. Word spread quickly in our small town, and the whispers followed Susie everywhere. Johnny's smug facade cracked as his reputation as the fun cab driver soured. People weren't so charmed by a man who chased after married women. For me, though, the whispers didn't matter. I was focused on rebuilding, on creating a new life for myself and my boys. Susie had taken so much from me, but she wouldn't take everything. I wouldn't let her. The reckoning was over, but the recovery was just beginning. And for the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe.